Hello and welcome back to Microsoft Virtual Academy. We're in Module 3 of the XAML for Windows 10 Layouts course. I'm Darren May, this is Jerry Nixon.
Hi. Again.
Again.
We're still here.
We are.
We're loving it.
Continue.
All right. So we've been talking about layouts. We've been talking about what it means and then how to build your own. This is a pretty cool module we're about to do. This module is what it would be if we did effective layouts, that is basically practical things that you want to do. So there are ways and app patterns that a lot of developers have already done, and you may be wanting to do and wondering how, and we can lead you down some of the better paths to actually hit some of those.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot to do. There's a lot of options, but we're going to hit just 4 of them. And so the first one is this idea of active canvas, and we'll talk about the details of that and some implementation things to consider. Then this idea of master details. It happens all the time that people are building master details, especially in line of business applications. Tabs, implementing tabs, and then also the navigation panel, sometimes referred to as the hamburger menu.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all of these are sophisticated in their own right.
And it's key to also point out that these patterns are described on the MSDN documentation, and they're kind of the archetypical app nav patterns that are actually described.
Yeah, that's right. And so this is really the overall pattern for your app. Well, you'll see as we get into it. It's really exciting. Very good. Okay, so before we talk about anything, I think we should talk just a moment about Template 10. So Template 10, at its core, is really a replacement to the project templates in Visual Studio, or in addition to the existing project templates in Visual Studio. If you go right now and say File New Project in Visual Studio, you'll only get the blank project, and that's really not enough, not from our perspective, because there's a lot of boilerplate code that every developer is going to have to write. And so Template 10 fills that gap. And so of course, it includes a library in NuGet that gives a lot of functionality. And the reason we bring it up right here is because Template 10 will be the base of all of our demos.
Yep, absolutely.
And why wouldn't it be? Because we don't want to have to code all that boilerplate stuff either, not now that we've written it into Template 10. Worth knowing that you can go to GitHub. All of this is free, of course. You can go to GitHub, get the code itself. In GitHub, by the way, is also a ton of sample projects that are really useful, including what we're about to show today. There's, I think all of them are up there.
Cool.
And it's also an extension inside Visual Studio. If you want to know how can I get these new file or project templates, all you have to do is Extension Manager inside Visual Studio, search for Template 10 or just T10, and you'll find it showing up, install it, and you've got it. And
the other key thing as well is it's not just Jerry and Darren that are building this. It's also open source. Yeah. Engage the community. There's lots and lots of pull requests going on, lots of interaction, lots of work and combination. Yeah, it's pretty cool all the way around. Hundreds of pull requests and hundreds of commits. It's really an amazing project. It's been it's really changed, I'll be honest, it changed my perspective of open source. Yeah, I always thought it was sort of, I thought something else. And now I can appreciate. What we're really seeing is the value of having lots and lots of contributors, lots of different perspectives and insights, and just the bandwidth that you get from multiple people working on this thing.
Yeah, testing crazy things, and people in other countries testing left to right and right to left, when we didn't think to test that, and all of a sudden it's better than it was before. All right, anyway, that's Template 10. It's going to be the base of all the demos that we do here today. It's available to you, and it is awesome. No getting past it. All right. Let's talk about the first pattern that we would come to, and that's active panel. So the active panel, we'll explain it to you here. In fact, I'll just yield the floor to my colleague, Darren May.
Okay, so active panel. The key thing about the active panel is it's really based around this idea of a single view. So if you think about a painting program or perhaps a mapping program or whatever, you're really in a single view, you might have additional control elements come over the top of that view, but you're not really navigating away from that application. Yeah. You might have toolbars and so on that are present that you can interact with, but fundamentally it's one-page application, and that's pretty much all.
And certainly not static. That's the reason it's active. You're doing something. You're interacting with it. You're adding or moving to it, panning around. Somehow it's active. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Why don't you show a more rich sample there?
All right. Well, this is an example. This, in fact, is going to be the demo we show here in just a minute. And in this case, by active panel, what we mean is we're going to add the inking control.
Yep.
Yeah, so you can draw on that, annotate however you want. In this case, we've brought up an image, and we have annotated on that image using an orange ink.
Absolutely. Okay.
Cool business. And I might point out, you're going to show this to him, but this is only a PowerPoint slide. but there's a couple of controls you're going to show off, including this control right here at the top. And I won't steal your thunder, but I want everybody to be able to draw their attention to that.
Well, my thunder is stolen, and
Rolling thunder.
Exactly, rolling thunder. Okay, so if we have a look at my Visual Studio, what I've got here is an application that really demonstrates the active canvas. And so I think probably best just to run it first and then talk about what's going on. So let's run up the application.
It's worth saying that this, of all of them, is actually quite simple because a lot of these controls are encapsulated in the framework.
Yes. So what we have here, application, single view, there's no navigation controls and so on and so forth. We have up the top left-hand side here a name. Right now there's no name because we have no element that's loading into it. We have the thunder stolen control here that we'll come back to in a moment.
Thunder stolen.
We have the central canvas where we're going to actually be performing our work. We have a toolbar down the bottom here, which is pretty much a standard implementation. If I open this up, I'm going to bring in a image. So now we've loaded an image into our application, and we have the ability to interact with this. We have this ink toolbar control that comes from Microsoft Research. That is actually an extension method, or extension to
Visual Studio.
Visual Studio and the platform that we can add in. So I can interact with here. I can specify a color, a pen size, and then I can use touch on this canvas and so on and do whatever annotations I would like to do. So that gives me that ability. I then have the ability to save out.
Now this might be where the bulk of the code actually exists.
Yeah, most of this is actually in achieving functionality, which is really what you're looking for. So if we bring in, we can see that we have our image. We can bring that back in. And so there's our annotations and everything.
Good job. That's cool.
So let's go and have a look at the code. We can also see that the image name has changed as we've loaded in images.
Now wait, before you do, you're you're using the ink canvas. In fact, let me just go back to the slide of this for just a second. This is a combination of an image control right here and the ink canvas on top of that.
Which is exactly what I'm about to show.
Ah, yeah, beautiful. All right, take us to the code.
So if we jump over to the code, what we can see is how this UI is designed. So although this is called an active canvas, you're going to want to have other elements that are laid out in a manner that's responsive. And so we generally use the grid as the foundation for most of these types of controls.
Yes.
We have some row definitions. We happen to have a top row, which is where we show our header. You may recall in an earlier module, we talked about the auto height. And so that's being sized based around the content of our top elements. These two elements are contained within our top row. One of the interesting things about the grid.row and grid.column attached properties is they default to 0. And so these don't actually show either of those, which means it's going to be in the top row. The ink toolbar is aligned right, which is why it appears in the top right. So if I quickly flick over to the references, what we can see here is we have the ink toolbar control. So that's an extension that's been installed, and you can add that once you've installed the extension by going into Add References, opening up Universal Projects, Extensions, and you can see that highlighted here.
Nice.
Quick aside we should mention is a lot of people see this exclamation mark
specifically with Behaviors
SDK. All this is saying is this wasn't built for Windows 10, and there may be issues. There aren't issues in reality. So don't worry about it. A lot of people are very concerned when they see that, and they assume all manner of things are not going to work properly.
They assume a warning symbol means error.
Yes. Okay, and as the tooltip presents right there, it actually tells you about it. Go and check the compatibility.
Nice.
Okay, and to install it, you go to Tools, Extensions and Updates, and this is where you would go and search for Ink.
Free to the developer,
toolbar.
built by Microsoft.
Yep. And here is the control. And as you can see, we've got the check mark that indicates it's already installed.
Otherwise, when you're using the ink canvas, there's simply no UI whatsoever.
Absolutely. You would have to code your own. So as Jerry was mentioning beforehand, the way our UI is built up, it's inside a particular grid row. And we have another grid, which we call the image frame. Inside there, we have our image source. So this sits at the bottom level of the grid. And this is the image that we load in that we're going to do annotations on. The ink canvas itself then sits above that, so it captures touch interaction, mouse interaction, and so on and so forth. And that is where we draw our ink. To the user, it would appear that the ink is annotating the image itself. It's actually two separate elements, and so we had to do some additional work to be able to save those things out. Along the bottom, we have our page.bottom app bar. Inside there, we have a command bar, and inside there, we just have two app bar buttons that give us our ability to interact with the open local and save local. We're using binding here to get into our open image command and save image command in our view model. We're going to touch on binding in a later module. But fundamentally,
needless to say, this makes it work.
This makes it work. This is the plumbing. If we look at the code behind for here, so this is the code behind for our main page. In here, this is where we set up our input devices. So by default, it is only set to pen.
So the ink canvas, by default, won't work unless you have a pin or the developer sets up these extra types.
Absolutely. And so we set those up, and then that makes that work. If you weren't using the ink toolbar, you would actually have to create all your own code to set up your default ink, your drawing styles, and so on, handling erasers, and so on and so forth. If I flip back to the XAML, what we can see here is when I add the ink toolbar control, I have a target ink canvas, and I bind to it by name. That is my ink canvas down here, and that's all you need to do to get all the goodness that comes in the ink toolbar control.
Everything else is built into the ink toolbar for you.
Absolutely.
Nice. Then you place it wherever you want it to be.
Exactly. And so from this perspective, we've got all we need for our ink canvas. If I run this again, one of the nice things about this is we're inside a grid. That gives us all of our responsiveness. So if I load in my image again, I can resize, and my app UI updates. And that's really what we're looking for when we're building these types of applications, is making sure it works across the full spectrum of resolutions and positions we want to have.
Nice. Very nice. And then when you save it out, it's worth pointing out a little bit of a trick going on. Not trick, that sounds like it's sleight of hand.
Yes.
A little bit of effort going on where
exactly. So it
may not be what developers think it's going to be.
Yeah, it's a little different than it was in Windows 8.1. With Windows 8.1, you didn't have the ink canvas control. So you laid a canvas on top of your image, and you used an ink presenter and an ink manager to actually draw all your ink onto that canvas. You would still need to save those things out. And the way that you would save it out is, if we flick to my XAML, we have this containing grid called image frame. And we would take this and we would use an approach called render target bitmap. The whole point of that is it takes a control and converts the presentation of that control into a bitmap that you could then save. Because your ink was contained within a canvas, that will participate in the whole render target bitmap cycle. Unfortunately,
that was Windows 8.
That was Windows 8. Unfortunately, ink canvas in Windows 10 does not presently collaborate in render target bitmap, which basically means the ink is hidden when you render out the bitmap. So what to do? I wanted to demo this scenario, and so we needed to do a little bit of an investigation to work out what's going on. So if I look in my save image command, I have a pretty simple method in here, which actually ends up invoking a method back in my view. The reason I elected to do this was I like to separate view-specific activities to things that are in the view, i.e. things that are manipulating controls, and logic to be contained within my view model. That's my personal preference. Other people would perhaps insist that there should be no code at all in the code behind. I try to be a little bit more pragmatic and say, if it makes sense for it to be there, put it there.
Seems healthy to be balanced.
Sure. So what I have in my main page is I have this save image. One of the interesting things is we're also leveraging a NuGet package called Win2D. Do you know what Win2D is, Dan?
It was the predecessor to Win3D.
No.
Oh.
But nice try.
Would Win2D be the C# wrap or managed wrapper around Direct2D?
That is what it is indeed. So again, that's a NuGet package. It's available. And one of the great things about it is it gives you access to the high performance of your graphics cards. So when we were talking about canvases earlier, that there is an opportunity to use a canvas control, which is part of Win2D. We are not going to be using it to render anything on our screen, but we are going to use it as an intermediary to allow us to export out both our image and our ink, so we can save a bitmap which represents the combined image and annotations.
Okay, so all that to say, it's a little bit complicated to save the ink over an image.
Yep.
Lucky for you, we have all of the code for you in the sample for this course.
Absolutely.
All right, brilliant. So that's the active canvas. That in our case, we're using inking, but it could have been other things like mapping or something that is one screen.
Yes.
All right, that's beautiful. All right, that's the active campus. Active campus?
Well, yeah.
Active panel. Active panel. Now let's talk about another common scenario, and that's this master detail. We've had it since really the beginning of software, it seems like. This is where you have lots of records, and you want to see one at a time. And so this might be the overall look and feel of how you might start. And so in this case, there's a list view on the left, right, where you're seeing a list of all of your records right here. And then as you select just one, then that record is what shows over here on the right-hand side. So this is sort of reminiscent of maybe the mail application. And to that end, we have a demo that looks somewhat like the mail application.
Yeah, it's almost foreshadowing.
It's crazy how it works. All right, here we go. This is what it is right here, and I'll just show just the layout of the application so you can understand. So we have this messaging service, which in the real application might go out to your email service or whatever. It's all mock data, of course, for this demo. And it all fills up a message. So a message is just like an email message. So it has subject, body, to and from, and the date, and that's all. Then we have the view model and the view that it goes into, the end. This is all that really we're playing with. But most of the work that's going to be accomplished inside this demo is really in the XAML, right? If I were going to open up the code behind, there's not a lot going on. This is just the standard stuff. Nothing actually has been added. The bulk of the work is really inside the XAML itself. And so let me just pull up and show some basic pieces. So the first is we've got a handful of converters, things we want to happen based on the data binding, but we'll talk about binding in another course. Instead, let's roll down and see we have a data template. So this is the next thing in that list. So we have a data template that says this is what each message item, and I'll just jump back, each of these individual items is repeated and needs to have some sort of template. This is that template. And then we have right here another data template. Ignore the blue underlines as they are not representing an error. But we have another data template. So in this case, this is the message detail template. This is the message detail over here, and it had one giant template. Now, why are we doing it that way? That's because on the right-hand side is not a bunch of controls. No, on the right-hand side is a presenter that swaps out its data so that we can select any of these, and we give ourselves the option then so that we select A, B, C, D, E, and then F is a different type altogether, and we would still be able to handle it. But we are only handling one type at a time in this case. But that's one of the reasons we do it that way. Okay, so that's that data template. And then we have this quick little setter, this little style with a set of setters inside it. And this is setting up the way we want the left list view to look. Now here's the exciting part.
And we'll talk about styles in more detail on a later module as well.
That's right. I keep jumping quickly, but that's because this is really to show the implementation of a pattern, not the individual pieces. And so now we go into the Visual State Manager of this overall page. This is where a lot of the logic and work is done. And in fact, let me just break some things together here like this. And I don't know if you can actually break things together. That didn't make sense. All right, so now those are all broken together. We have visual groups and visual states. And so here are two visual states that will toggle in between whenever the view is narrow. That means to say it might fit on a phone or a very small tablet. And so when it is, it'll go between narrow master open and narrow detail open. And then, in fact, let me run it real quick and just show you what that means, because I think that might kind of explain it a little more. And so right now, this is the mail application, right? And if you kind of envision in your mind. But I'll make it real narrow first, like so. All right, so now let's pretend we're on a small tablet. And as you can see, we have all the lists like normal, but there's nothing on the right-hand side. That's because there's no room for it. But if I were to select, let's say, the next one, then the next one, then you can see is showing just the record with a back button that will take us to the list. So now we're looking at details, and we're able to return to master. And then we're clicking on another to return to details, and we're able to return then to master.
But normally you'd expect to see that back arrow when you're doing some form of navigation. Are we navigating here?
Right, even though this feels like navigation, this is really just switching out the view. Of course, we have the option. We could navigate to another page that shows the detail. That wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but not necessary in this case. So
yeah, so what you're really doing is
feels like navigation.
you're building something that's responsive initially, and then becomes adaptive to the fact that it can no longer present all of the information, so you're now changing how it behaves based upon that size.
In fact, let me go ahead and show you. So I'll make it extra wide, and you can see when it's extra wide, like, let's see if I can grab the edge here, like so, right? You can see that the master list here is actually quite wide. You know, it comes to almost to half the screen. And as it starts getting more narrow, the first thing to give is the master, so I can narrow that list a little bit more. And then as I start making it more and more narrow, it doesn't have any room to give, so this starts to give. And that's that responsive that you were talking about. Yeah, exactly right. And then as I get super narrow, let's say like right here-ish, then it switches into the narrow mode. And so let's see how it's doing it. It's doing right here, when it switches over to narrow, it has two options, either master or detail. That's what we were talking about. But when it's in normal, it has a narrow, normal, or wide. And so we saw wide, where it had that extra space on the left. Normal is where it gets a little bit more narrow. And then narrow is actually swapping up to make sure that these are the active groups instead of any of these down here.
So the Visual State Manager is just allowing us to group together a bunch of different properties so that we can use a quick shorthand to switch between one set of properties and another set of properties.
And in fact, let me open it up and show you that the only thing that's really going on in here, let me stop it so I have a little more real estate to show you. So this is just the normal state. And so in the normal state, it occurs, I'll use an adaptive trigger, for when the normal min width, so I've set that above in a variable. And so let me hide that so we don't think about it. Just know that the trigger causes it to happen. And then we do these three, and only these three things, right? We we show the delete button, and we also change the left column to be 320, and then the search in that same column is also 320, just so it matches. That's really all that we do. And if I were to open up the other visual states, they really are just doing small things like that as well. You can see here everything's getting a little bit wider and nothing else. Seems like a lot of magic, but it's actually a simplistic approach.
So the key thing to this is really to visualize what your UI is going to look like in these various states, and then to build a series of XAML that makes it as simple as possible to trigger between those. It's kind of very difficult to kind of back into this solution. You've got to really think about what you're doing from the outset.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. That's exactly correct. All right, so this is the idea, and let me show you two quick things that might be interesting. So this is the overall UI, right? And so the UI is made up of just two things, a list view on the left, and then a content control. I said content presenter, but I meant to say content control on the right. And so that content control then, I'm able to set its content to some kind of object, right? In this case, it's going to be a message. And I'm binding it to selected, which is inside my view model. And then it has a content template, which we saw above, that was defined so that I could reuse it if I wanted to, move it out to a visual state, or not a visual state, but a resource dictionary or something like that, called message detail template.
Okay. I think it's worthwhile pointing out a couple of things here. We've got the static resource element that we mentioned in a previous module as how we could go and pull resources out of a dictionary.
That's right.
We also used binding, which was a XAML extension. And we use binding in this particular scenario rather than xbind because the properties to which we were binding are not strongly typed. They're objects.
That's right. That's right. So if, for example, that is especially true right here in selected item. This is really the one that plays to what you're talking about. So if I were to use xbind, and so xbind's like you said, a perfectly typed kind of binding, it would work if we didn't have this, right? If we didn't have this little piece that says mode two-way. If I took that away, then it would be able to read from my selected message and cast that into an object. That part's no problem. But because it's two-way, it means that every time that the user clicks on a new item inside list view, it sets or writes to the other direction, the selected item, into my view model property selected. And there is no way to cast an object into a message. We know that it would work, but it doesn't know it would work, so you'd get an error. Why aren't you using xbind here? Because xbind must match data types.
Yeah. Now there's a way to work around it. You could create a custom converter that abstracts that cast away, and then xbind doesn't worry about it and invokes that converter as part of that process. But that really, to a certain extent, does away with the whole point of using xbind to accelerate binding.
Yeah. You could definitely do it that way without ruining your app, but it would be, I don't know, it's like flipping a coin in my mind. It would be one of the few converters that has convert back.
Yes.
That's kind of fun.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, so that's the gist of it. And let me just jump back to slides for a moment and Perfect. And so this is that master detail. Remember, on the right-hand side is that content control, that all you're doing is setting it to whatever the user set, and then we are applying a template to that content so it draws it properly. So we've already defined what it's going to look like inside the template that's in the resource dictionary. In fact, let me just see if I can switch over to design mode real quick and let you see what we see when we're building the whole thing. So here we are, right? You can see that on the left we have a few sample values, and then on the right-hand side, this is that one that needs a record so that we can see the whole thing. Here we have search, the search box, the whole thing wrapped inside a command bar where it's at the top instead of the bottom, partly because we were modeling this after the mail app, and so we were trying to make it look, as close as possible. Yeah. Overall, pretty simple little application.
Sure. One of the key things that we haven't mentioned thus far is blend. And one of the key benefits that Blend has over the Designer in Visual Studio is the ability to be able to switch between those visual states and see exactly what they look like.
Yeah, that's right. And you cannot do that in Visual Studio. You can only do that in Blend to be able to preview what those visual states look like. So if you don't want to run your app over and over again in order to see what those changes were to your visual group or your visual state, then Blend is an easy solution. You can do it all at design time. It's really nice.
It is.
In fact, not only can you preview it, but you can also set things with it as well.
Yes.
Sometimes it's easier to switch to your visual state, change all the things you want to change. That's your visual state done for you. Now it's really, really nice. Blend's a pretty powerful tool.
Yes, indeed.
All right, so there we go. Trip Tucker. You know what show Trip Tucker's on?
Oh, gee, Star Trek?
I don't know. All right, let's see. That's master detail, and perfect. That is the demo of master detail.
Okay, and so next we're going to talk about tabs and pivots.
Tabs and pivots. Maybe you could call it even tabs with pivots.
Yes.
Yeah.
Achieving tabs with the pivot control.
That's right. And so what does that look like? You've seen it before on websites as they get more narrow, sometimes on other mobile applications. You can see along the top navigation. How do they do that? How they implement it? I'm writing a Windows app. I want to do it too. Walk us through it.
Well, I mean, the reason for using tabs and pivots is it gives you very quick access to categories. If you've got a number of commonly used categories, you're going to flip between them. If you think about the Edge web browser, you have tabs which represent each of the pages. It allows you a very quick navigation paradigm. It starts to lose its effectiveness as you open 500, or perhaps if you open 51 pages. It starts to get harder and harder because you can't see your titles and so on and so forth.
Good point.
So it's a pattern that could be overused, but there are many applications out there, such as the MSN News application, that leverages it to move between news categories and so on.
Right, where you might see national, sports, politics, or whatever, but it's almost a fixed set. It doesn't have to be fixed, of course, but it almost is a fixed set.
So let's take a look at an example of this. So one of the key things that we tried to do when we were putting together these patterns is to refer to what was on MSDN and look at the guidance that was being provided there and build things that evoked that guidance, that followed some of the examples that were there, that may not necessarily be simple and straightforward to actually achieve just out of the box with, say, the pivot control. So what I have running on my desktop right now is a sample pivot application. And so we're following the guidelines that are present in that we have the tabs in a desktop mode are aligned to the left. They're pretty clear, that nice bold text and so on. We can navigate between them. As you can see, we get nice animations as we move backwards and forwards between our elements. This is the desktop view. As we transition to a mobile view, where I narrow it down and so I trigger into the mobile, we now move to a different layout, which kind of gives us a centralized presentation of these tabs.
So there are a couple of things that changed that I saw. Now they're centered, which is nice.
Yes.
And is the text different?
So we've reduced the size of the text, but we've also introduced an icon. So again, some of the guidance that's been presented in the design guidelines is that icons are useful in a touch scenario because they increase your target size for touch interactions, and they're less useful in a desktop mode. So what we've done is we changed our font size and we introduced the imagery as well as changed the alignment. Now this wasn't particularly straightforward to achieve. We had to do a number of styling changes, and so let me walk you through that. So let's bring up.
I suppose if there's anything positive out of this, it's that it can be done.
It absolutely can.
And it's not like it took a week for us to figure it out. It just took a long afternoon.
So what we did was we went into the controls and we extracted styles. There are some different ways you can approach extracting styles. You can use the Blend design tool or the XAML designer. Some of these things we actually went to generic.xaml, the master generic.xaml, which we're going to be touching on a little bit later in some of the other control-oriented demos as well.
That's right.
But basically what we did is we pulled out these styles. Now, one of the interesting things around performance is you want to have your styles or your resources rather, as local as you need to make sure that they're not parsed.
Tricky language you got there. It is local as you need to.
Yes, because sometimes if you're going to use them everywhere, then it makes sense for those styles to be globally available. The challenge with that is it means all of those styles have to be parsed during your application startup. Whereas if you have them just the place that you use them, then you only incur that overhead when you actually are using those styles. So it's a balance.
That's right.
But if you're creating something that you're going to use across your entire application, by all means put it in app.xaml or a style or a resource dictionary rather that you reference from app.xaml.
So this control is pretty heavy on styles, but I'm still wanting you kind of to show us what we had to do.
Sure. So if I just scroll down for a time being, I just want to show how relatively straightforward it is to actually lay out the pivot itself.
Yeah.
So we have just a regular pivot control. We have a pivot item. We happen to have a style which has got selected pivot item on it. And all that style does is actually just change the background color for this particular...
You might extract it like that so you could control it elsewhere.
Exactly. It saves you having to do it. If you change this in multiple places, it's easier to have a central reference point. Within each pivot item, we have a header. And so again, this is an example where you could have it inline and just specify text for the header, but I wanted to have a richer header that was reminiscent of the style guidelines.
Now, okay, so there is no tab control.
There is
the pivot control.
Correct.
Each tab then is a pivot item.
Yes.
And to make it look like a tab, we are customizing the header of each pivot.
Correct.
All right.
So we're doing that in a number of ways. We're doing it in a style above, but we're also placing inside here a user control that I created that has a label, has a glyph, which is a graphic that will show which is our icon, and a custom background. If I quickly look at the header control, we can see it's just a user control. It has some visual states that change between the two modes that we want. Narrow is going to show the icon. Normal is going to show larger text and no icon. Down here we have a font icon, which is bound to the glyph and the label that we pass in.
Okay.
And if we look into the code behind here, we can see here are dependency properties that we mentioned beforehand in a previous module, which allows us to set those values. I'm not going to dwell too much on that. Now, this out of the box would not have worked as we'd intended because the standard pivot control restricts its height to 48.
That would clip off all your text.
Exactly, and so that's not desirable. So in order to work around that, we needed to make some styles. So if we look in pivot,
and we haven't mentioned this except for in other courses where you can re-template or restyle any control. And so this is what you have done to the pivot control.
Exactly. So what I'm doing right now is just expanding up my styles. So I have all of these present. So if we jump up to this particular location, first and foremost, we've added some extra states for our controls.
So sometimes it's like a phone narrow, sometimes it's a desktop experience.
Exactly. So we added some extra states into our pivot to deal with our narrow and wide. And what this does is it changes our horizontal content alignment for our pivot tabs. So in narrow mode for phone, we centralize our tabs. For desktop or wide, we place them
horizontally stretched.
Yes.
Which feels left to us because inside their own container, they actually are on the left.
Exactly.
Which is really very important because they will also cycle through. Right?
Exactly.
So you want to make sure wherever that left button and right button that the user controls where their pivot or where their tabs are is still a natural experience. It's on the right-hand side or the left-hand side.
So then the next style that we needed to work on was the pivot header item. So one of the key things here is we don't actually have a key on this style, but we do have a target type. This means it will be applied to all pivot header items that appear in the same scope as this resource definition. So this happens to be defined on this main page, so it means all pivot header items on this main page will automatically inherit this style.
So this is similar to perhaps a CSS class without a class name, you know, where you would go directly to an H1, and all H1s get applied to it because there's no specific class name. We refer to these as implicit styles. So very nice, powerful too.
So a couple of things we've done in here. We've changed the padding around our header to bring things closer together. We've also got rid of the hard-coded 48 value.
This is what was going to clip your text.
Yes, and now we've set this to auto, which allows it to be sized based upon content.
Your tabs could be gigantic now.
They could be. Probably a poor experience if 90% of my UI was tab. But
well, you put a scroll bar in there, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I've got a scroll bar. So that's that part. Then the final thing that we did is we also added in a change to our background color. So by default, we had a system control highlight that was being applied to our selected tab. We now changed this so I can actually override that and set whatever color I want to have as my background color. And so that's defined in another property up here, which I can't get to right now.
It's all right.
So that's what's going on there. And that's how we had to create all of these various items to override our basic behaviors to achieve this look. So let me run that again.
It's pretty fascinating that you didn't actually implement much code.
No.
Really, you're just tweaking the styles to look exactly the way you need your code, which really means you'll take our sample and tweak it as well.
Yes.
Right? And I also noticed that in that XAML you were showing, there are a lot of keyframe animations, which makes me think that the generic XAML must have shipped with the pre-optimized setters.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Visual setters. Interesting.
Exactly. It's kind of, it feels a little bit throwback.
Yeah, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it's funny. It's
it does.
Like 3 months old. We're all like, ah.
Yeah, so if we come back to what we've got here actually in terms of the UI. So our custom background, we have a transparent color here, which is showing through this white area. We decided to have part of this background peek underneath to give us this real bold underline for a particular tab. So we get this color. As we mouse over, you see we get these states. These, again, can be customized. We see the text is brightening as we move over it. We click on, we get this transition, which is all part of the lovely pivot control in terms of bringing this stuff together.
It slides to the side, yeah.
Slides in as a nice entrance transition. But again, you can add these to your own controls. And so, you know, I think it gives a great experience. And the fact that it easily responds and gives us the different behaviors, I think this is a great baseline for building these types of UIs.
Developers might wonder, you know, hey, I'm really interested in this tab control. Maybe they have one on another platform and it already has tab activities. I'd really like to do that. Well, here you go. You know, this is more than just design guidance, which there's plenty of that on MSDN. This is, in fact, there's a lot more than we even mentioned about you should really think about this and that. And but here's some actual implementation kind of to show you, get you started and going as well. What we won't say though is this is not the solution for you. This is kind of the guide for you to follow. Unlike other things that we're showing here, where you can just take what we've done and run with it, this one really is take what we've done and learn from it.
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Definitely. All right, so jump back here for a second, Danny. Thank you. Wow. You see how fast that was?
That was.
Oh my.
That was his head hitting the keyboard.
And that's awesome. So we, just as a reminder of the solution that Darren just talked about, so the pivot control, which I just added this to our slide. I thought that would be nice to see, right? It has been around since Windows Phone, and we've all loved it. It was ported over to desktop, and we all really do love it. And without a tab control, it actually operates like a tab control, just feels different in its behavior. And we're restyling its behavior. So where you might see a pivot, that's simply the tab, and we're just making it so that the pivot looks different in its head. The end. It really is a pretty simple approach. You want it to be wider, smaller, you don't like that underline or whatever. This is really up to you to make that perfect. This is really just to get you started and show you can do it. Don't forget, open it up in the designer, right-click and say Edit Template. You'll get everything there. And if anything else, you just want the original, you can go to the generic.xaml that ships with the SDK. Where do you get the SDK? Visual Studio. You've already got it.
Yes.
Yeah, you've already
baked in.
Okay. Beautiful.
I think we've got one more.
Yeah, indeed we do. Let's talk about the navigation pane. So the navigation pane, a.k.a.
P-A-I-N?
It can be spelled P-A-I-N if you try and implement it yourself.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is the hamburger menu, and a lot of excitement around the hamburger menu because it adds a lot of functionality and parity with other platforms out there as well. A lot of excitement out there because some designers go crazy because they love it, and others go crazy because they don't love it. This is really up to your designer or your developer to decide what's right for you. Let's pretend we know it's right for you, and we want to implement it. How do we do it? We're not going to show you. That is the absolute truth. But what I will show you is how we implement it inside Template 10, and how you can leverage Template 10 to bring the navigation pane or the hamburger menu into your application. And so let me show you inside Visual Studio. I have the Nav demo up here. The Nav demo, even though it's called Nav demo, is actually, let me just show you if I were to create a brand new project, go into the Template 10 node. Remember, I added this simply by going into Tools, Extensions, searching for Template 10 and installing it. Once it's there, I have these two new projects, Blank and Minimal. As soon as I have Minimal, there's a little screenshot down here that shows you that Minimal is actually the implementation of the hamburger menu and a couple other small things. Blank is as blank as you can get. It's just blank, so there's nothing. But Minimal is a nice starting place, especially if Windows development is new to you or Windows app development is new to you especially. And all right, so I'm not going to create a new one. I've already got it right here. I called it Nav Demo when I created it. And it's structured nicely as a few empty folders as well, but that's by design. What I want to show you, though, is that inside the references, I have a NuGet package here called Template 10. This is where most of the logic is. And so if I were to run this application, which I'll do right now, it will implement the split view control. Got it. Split view control.
So the split view control is something that gives us the foundational ability to have those slide-in panels coming in as part of the hamburger experience.
That's right, and just like we talked about in just the immediately previous module, we have a layout control that has no look and feel of its own. The only look and feel that it has are its children. And so we have the split view, and it doesn't look like a hamburger menu. We need to build out the UI of the hamburger menu. It's a complicated little thing. We've been able to do it for you. And so this is what it looks like. If I were to run the Minimal project. This is it right out of the box, doesn't have anything. I can go in and it handles things like passing in different values and things like that. But the important part is right here. This is the Nav menu where I can slide it over, and it has one button. You can add all the buttons you want, as well as secondary. So we call these primary and secondary buttons. Primary button at the top, secondary button at the bottom. This pane then is opened and closed based on whether or not you're clicking this right here, this 3-line, we call a hamburger menu.
Yeah, and that's the key thing is the split view does not give you a hamburger button. You have to write that yourself, and
it also doesn't give you these navigation buttons. It doesn't give you absolutely anything at all. Everything visual.
Just the ability to slide something in.
Doesn't interact with the frame, navigation service, nothing. It's really just a layout control.
So why don't you show it's responsive as you change its size?
Yeah, so let me go ahead and make some changes. So this is me making it more and more narrow, and as I get super narrow, let's see if I can get narrow enough.
You are super narrow.
Oh, I sure am. Yeah, more narrow. All right, more cowbell. All right, so now you can see there's no buttons on the left.
Yep.
That's because if you were imagining you were on the phone, you may not want to waste all the real estate down the left. This is a common pattern as well. Now clicking the button at the top reveals the menu, but when it's away using a, what do you call that, light tap? Light dismiss. Using light dismiss, it goes away and doesn't take up any real estate, and just kind of, it comes over, right? And the overlay is over the content that's there. So this is the narrow mode, and as you go more narrow into the phone, it just keeps going from this point. There's nothing more you could do to the nav menu. You would start reacting with your own content as well. All right, so we'll go back. This is narrow, and then we go back to kind of to the normal view. You can see how we started out. And then if we go super wide, as soon as I get to super wide, can I get super wide on this monitor? There it is. All right, so as soon as I go to super wide, there is no hamburger button anymore, and the reason there's no hamburger button is...
Did you see that little gratuitous bounce of the hamburger button there?
Yeah, that was a couple versions ago. I like that. But it's because there's just no need for it anymore, and so now you can have all the buttons you want, and why would you hide the pane? There's really no reason to. Obviously, this is a control that we have included in Template 10 that you can... There's all these properties, including making sure that it doesn't do that or does do that. It's kind of up to you. All the coloring and layout, the structure, whether or not it's left to right or right to left. Everything like that is all implemented for you. and you can go and make it kind of whatever you need it to be. If you need it to look totally different, then don't use this, man. Just use the split view and go to town.
Yeah, I think one of the key things to say as well, though, is that this was not just totally dreamed up by yourself and a couple of other people and so on. This was leveraging a lot of the styling that had been based as a foundation in the MSN family of apps, News and so on and so forth.
That's right.
So it will look like it fits in the Windows 10 app family.
That's right. Internally here at Microsoft, we have quite a few design guidelines around all of our applications, and so we've gone into those and kind of stolen quite a bit, shared quite a bit of the things that they've discovered and brought that into this control so you have it as well. And so this isn't the end-all, be-all of controls, but it definitely will get you a long way down the hamburger menu path.
Yeah. Do you want to show some of the things of how you added in the various hamburger button, the nav buttons inside there? Just give a quick look at Shell.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Let me think about that. I'm going to need to, let's do that at GitHub, because that's where it is.
Okay. Don't you have the Shell in the minimal project?
Oh, I have Shell?
Yeah.
Well, sure, I have Shell.
That's what I mean.
For Pete's sake.
Yeah.
Oh, Shell.
Yeah, you can be sure of Shell.
Yes. Yep. Shell? Shell, yeah. Got it. All right, Shell. Here we go, right here. So, in fact, let me just say real quickly what's going on here. When I'm inside my application, I'm actually inside two different pages. I'm inside, in fact, let me jump back to slides just to make this point. Even though it looks like there's a page over here on the right, which of course there is, and a frame that I navigate through, the entire thing is a page as well. There's a lot of reasons that we used a page and not something else. Some of it has to do with how the phone works and other pieces like that. And then here is just the pane dedicated to the split view, which we've included an items control of radio buttons. So this is actually a radio button, even though you don't see that. We've re-templated it so it doesn't look like a radio button. So it looks more like the button that belongs inside. Why did we do that? Because we wanted to group them together, make sure only one was checked. We also wanted to split that group up so we could have secondary buttons down here, and they could still participate in that nav group or that button group, so that as you check, it unchecks all the others.
And this comes back to what we were talking about in the previous module as well, that you should always be looking at what is already present in the framework and seeing what you can be derived from if you're trying to come up with something. It's very rare that you need to start from the ground up.
Oh yeah, that's exactly right. And using a radio button was a big boon for us too, because it gave us all the accessibility of a radio button, and it gave us the
theme aware, right to left, all of those things as well.
And it gave us all of that as well. Good, perfect. Boy, when I space out, you're right there. I love it. All right, perfect. Now, the entire page then is a shell. That's the first page that everything's in. And then the rest of your app is inside that subframe that's there over here on the right. So let's take a look at just the shell right here. I'll jump over to shell and show you the XAML that allows us to define what those primary and secondary buttons are. So let me just open this up. Right, so there's a couple of visual states that handle things, but we won't mess with that right now. So here's the control, right? It's called hamburger menu. We've called it my hamburger menu.
Original.
Pretty powerful.
Assertive.
All right, so inside that, each of those buttons, we don't, remember, we're retemplating all of these for you inside template 10. And so all we need from you is all the information that should be in the button. So the first thing that you give us is, this is the list of them, by the way, the primary buttons. And you would have 1, 2, 3, however many buttons you want to have up there. And so now you tell us, like, for example, where does it navigate to? If you're going to click it, what does it clear the history when you do, things like that. And then inside its content property, you actually build out the button. So in this case, we're giving the icon and the text block, very similar to the button demo we did in the very first module of this course, where it's as simple as you can do, just toss in a symbol, toss in a button, now you've got it. And so you can copy what we have here, which is of course something you can easily do, or you can tweak it. You're like, oh, this 12 seems like a little too much, I wish it was less. Well, that's easy enough, you just change the 12, right? And so it's nice to have this exposed to the developer so they can do whatever they want. Repeat that same process then for secondary buttons. Those are the ones that go at the bottom, the end. That's the way that this is intended to work, and it's pretty easy to set up. Compare this to your basic from scratch implementation for a split view, and it's a big difference.
It's a big difference. Why don't you just run up your application quickly? Because I think there's something else that we should talk about, and that is that don't feel like your app should be based upon one of these patterns. it's pretty common, in fact, for it to be an aggregate of many of the patterns, such as the tab and the nav pane.
Yeah, that's a great example. So here on the main page, really that first page has almost nothing in it, but if we were to navigate to settings, it looks suddenly very familiar to us because at the top, we can move around through a pivot control that we have, which you just talked to, and it gives us a tab experience.
And so what we've now got is a much richer experience here. And the other key thing that we were also wanting to show as part of this was its theme-aware capability.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So in this case, your application will do the same thing as ours, where depending on how you reference styles, if you do it statically, this won't happen, but if you use theme resources, it will happen. So now I can tap this, and it'll change to be a light theme, and it'll recolor everything as it needs to be. So pretty powerful around those lines.
Yeah.
And so, again, you're composing multiple. So we just showed you 4 different approaches. We showed you the what was the first one?
Active canvas.
Active panel. Active panel.
Active.
Well, it depends on which slide we're looking at. And master detail. Also, we showed tabs and how you can use those. And then we just showed the nav demo of where we can use the hamburger menu or some sort of navigation menu. And you can start putting those together to create a pretty rich experience that isn't convoluted. It actually makes a great experience for the user because sometimes one of these approaches isn't enough to really get them into the data structure that's unique to your application.
Yeah. So this course as a whole, we tried to cover the basics of XAML and really a deeper dive into layout in itself.
Yep.
We then really showed how you could leverage the existing layout panels that exist and also how you can build your own layout panels. And then finally, we wanted to show how you could leverage the existing layout panels to achieve some of the app design archetypal patterns that exist in the Windows 10 landscape.
So don't forget what you have in your toolbox. A lot of things that you can either use right away, retemplate, or as we've shown, it's not the scariest process to build your own and leverage what's given to you and really what's done under the scenes for some of those controls already. So take all of this, see if it's true that it's as easy as we say it is, and come get the code. We've got it for you to come and just steal all that you want.
And if it's not as easy as we say it is, complain to Jerry.
That's right. My email is Darren at... All right, we'll see you in the store.